Let's talk Tanya for the 7th of Tamuz of a leap year. We're on the topic of God's internal unity. His unity in and of himself, how God himself, despite the fact that he has many different attributes and qualities, none of those are a detraction from the fact that God is essentially one. So in the last 3 chapters, we spoke about this in terms of the spheres or God's qualities and attributes, and we explained how, despite that all, God is still an inherent oneness. And today we're going to continue this conversation, but introducing another idea, which is the Asara Mamaris. As we've discussed earlier, in this part of Tanya, the creation of the world, God created the world by way of the 10 utterances. So that's the energy which creates the world and gives life to the worlds. And the question is, are these 10 utterances also absolutely and completely one with God? Why is that such a question? So let's examine the nature of words. As opposed to my feelings are me. I have a feeling. An idea that I have an idea. The words that I use are not me. The words that I use to convey or to express my thoughts or my feelings, they're from the dictionary. I use the same words that you use, because ultimately a word is a tool to express something, but it's not something that I created. It's not something that's part of me. It's me using an outside entity in order to express myself. So if we're going to follow this logic and say that the same thing applies to God, we have a problem. Because that means that if God is using words in order to bring creation into existence, then there is something outside of God, not creation, because creation itself, as we explained and have established, creation itself is only a product of God's energy, but the energy itself, which is words, that itself would seem to be, is something which is outside of God. So what we need to do is we need to come up a new definition for words, one which can apply to God's words and one which will not imply something which is separate from him. And what is that? So as it turns out, there's another 2 aspects or features that words have, and let's analyze that for a moment. One feature of words is that it reveals when I speak and I use words, I articulate my ideas. So right now, ideas or feelings that are inside me are now made accessible to someone outside of me. That's one feature of words. As long as I only have an idea or a feeling inside of me, no one can access them. There's another idea about words, which is, and here we're talking not so much about the words that I use when I speak, but the words I use when I think, because we also think using words. Let's say I have a feeling. I love someone. That's a feeling in my heart. But what am I going to do with that love? In order for that feeling to be converted, transferred into something which is tangible, for me to go and actually do a favor for that person, a favor of a very specific nature, I need to take that feeling, process it in my mind using words, and then suddenly that love becomes me calling up that friend of mine and saying, can we go out for lunch together? But theoretically, that feeling could have been going out for lunch together or could have expressed itself in many other ways. But the words in my mind limit that idea to a very specific expression of that love. These are the 2 things. When we say that God uses words in order to create all of creation, we're talking about these 2 things. Number 1, that God's creative powers which are within him, the words express them outside of him, outside of himself to all of creation. That's why we talk about the 10 utterances, calling them words, because that is one of the function of words. And the second idea is that God's kindness, for example, can express itself in many ways. Even we're talking about metaphors for kindness. There's light and there's water. So kindness itself can express itself in many ways. What exactly is being created by that kindness? So the 10 utterances, the words, they take that feeling of God and they give it a distinct identity and exactly the nature of that creation that is being created. So when we say that God has 10 utterances, we mean, what does that mean when we talk about of God's words? We mean that these are a means by which God expresses himself to creation, which is outside of himself, not really outside of himself, because we know it's all a product of God's creative energy, but it's, again, expressing it forward. And also it's the 10 utterances are the tools God uses in order to take the deeper energies that he has and to give them very discrete and defined qualities to them. On the other hand, the other quality of words, which we spoke about in the beginning of this segment, the idea that words are something which are outside of me, which I use in order to convey, that doesn't apply to God. Now, we're saying that the 10 utterances are different than when we speak, because when we speak, we're using words which are entities which are outside of us. We're saying by God, it's different. They're not entities that are outside of him. Is there a way to logically establish this idea, or do we have to accept it on faith? The Alter Rebbe is going to argue that actually there's intellectual argument that we can make to establish this idea that God's words are different than our words in this sense. And that argument the Alter Rebbe will present in tomorrow's Tanya.